Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at textual criticism in our continuing study of how we got our Bible. The textual question is this: can our copies of the Bible be trusted? You see, we don't have any of the original manuscripts. We don't have the original letters of Paul or the original writing of Moses. What we have are copies, and they're not just copies. More often than not, they're copies of copies of copies, and then to really get your mind going, there's cases where some of those copies come from not just one source, but where part of it comes from one source, and then maybe part of it comes from another source. That means that the textual criticism involves scholarly work with available manuscripts aimed at the recovery within the limits of possibility of the original text. And that means sometimes we're not exactly sure, but we usually have a pretty good idea. Let's examine that. You see, first of all, there's higher criticism, higher versus lower. Higher criticism looks at the outside factors of the book. And these aren't bad questions. In fact, we ask them all the time. We ask who wrote the book, where was it written, what outside factors influence its writing, and why was the book written. And we ask those all the time, although sometimes higher critics have gone sort of fast and loose in that area, postulating that, for example, the epistles of Paul weren't written by Paul, they were written by somebody else. And that usually gets quite fanciful. On the other hand, lower criticism, also known as textual criticism, asks the question, what does the passage say? It examines all the available manuscripts, and this is a very ancient study. In fact, Origen, the early church father, wrote something called the Hexapla. It was that kind of study of the Old Testament manuscripts in his day in 250 AD. And so this sort of thing has been going around for a long time. Now, here's one possible biblical example. In Joshua chapter 24 and verse 30, we read about how Joshua has died, and they buried him in the territory of his inheritance. And then notice, in Timnath-Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, on the north of Mount Gaash. That's Joshua chapter 24, verse 30. However, we read the parallel passage in Judges, and it almost reads the same. Notice they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath, but notice it's Timnath, not Timnath-Serah, Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. The verses are almost identical, and yet in one case we read of Timnath-Serah, and that's not a translational issue. The translators have rendered it correctly. And in Judges chapter 2 and verse 9, we read Timnath-Heres. And what has happened, you can sort of see it in the English, but it's even clearer in the Hebrew that the writer has transposed two letters. He's made that first letter the last letter, and the last letter the first letter. And you say, well, which writer did that? Who was right and who was wrong? And my answer is I don't know. But it looks like somebody, and I don't think it was the original writer, I think it was someone who was copying, mistakenly transposed two of those letters. It doesn't change the meaning of the overall passage. Joshua died and he was buried in this Timnath something or other, but was it Timnath-Serah or Timnath-Heres? Well, frankly, I'm not entirely sure. Genesis chapter 47 and verse 21 gives another such. Now, in this time, we actually have different Hebrew texts. We're going to look at that in a second. The New American Standard says, as for the people, and he's speaking of Joseph, how Joseph removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. That is, as the famine had come on the scene, and they gave all their money, and then they gave their land, and then they gave themselves, and he relocates them, according to New American Standard, to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. The King James Version, same passage, says, and as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt even to the other. Notice the King James and New American Standard read identically. You know, some stylistic differences, but it's taken from the same Hebrew text. However, the New International Version has changed this and said that Joseph reduced the people to servitude. I don't read anything about servitude in the New American Standard or the King James Version. Where are they getting this from? From where are they getting this, that Joseph reduced them to servitude, that is, to slavery? It's taken from this line. He removed them, in New American Standard says, to the cities. The Hebrew text there, and notice the New American Standard has translated it very, very literally. Aver, ot, or otho, excuse my Hebrew, la'arim. And so he removed them to the cities. However, if we consult the Samaritan Pentateuch, that's a copy of the Torah, but it came from the Samaritans and has a couple of differences, some that aren't so good, but this one actually might be correct. And the Samaritan Pentateuch changes the reading. I'm going to give you the English first, and then we'll look at the Hebrew. In the English translation, and he enslaved them to slavery from one end of Egypt's border to the other. That's a literal rendering of the Samaritan Pentateuch. And what's happened, notice, in the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, we have the word ha'avir, that's with that's a resh on the end. We would call it an R. But below that, the Samaritan Pentateuch, notice the letters look alike, but instead of being a resh, it's a daleth. It's what we would say a D. So instead of haver, it's aved. And the difference is between to remove someone, in fact, we have that word Hebrew, somebody who's been removed, versus being enslaved. And so the Hebrew text, notice, of the Samaritan Pentateuch, it's still Hebrew, but it says that he enslaved them. And then also the word at the end in the Hebrew text, it's ir, which is the word for city. Of course, it's plural, so it's irim, to the cities, versus the Samaritan Pentateuch, which again you have that distinction between the resh and the daleth, the R and the D. The letters actually look alike. It's whether it's curved a little bit or straight. And also there's the addition of a bait. So the difference is between Erim, which is cities, or Evadim, which would be slaves. Did he remove them to cities, or did he enslave them? And of course, that's quite a substantial difference between the Masoretic text of the Hebrew versus the Samaritan Pentateuch of the Hebrew. Now, when we come to the New Testament, and we're going to go further after this, and we're going to look at both Old Testament and New Testament manuscripts. The New Testament, of course, is written in Greek. We've been looking at Hebrew with the Old Testament. It's written in what was called Koine Greek, the Greek that came after Alexander the Great, when sort of everybody was speaking Greek, and Greek became sort of a common language. And with the New Testament, by and large, we're usually looking at the development of the codex as opposed to the papyri. Now, we do have New Testament papyri. They tend to be older. It's in later years that you begin to use the codex. And so with New Testament manuscripts, and even there we can date them. First, you have the uncials, which are capital letters. Between the 1st and the 8th century, most of the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament were written in all capital letters. That is uncials. Versus those later manuscripts from the 9th to the 16th century, and of course after that you have the printing press, and now they just begin printing type. But these are minuscules where they will, just like we do typically, we might give the name or the first word in the sentence as a capital letter, but everything else after that is small letters. Those are called minuscules. And so you can glance very quickly at a Greek text and see, is it fairly recent or is it very old, just by looking at the kind of letters. Now there's other things involved in that too, but that's the first thing you notice, whether they are uncials or minuscules. And of course we also have lectionaries. These were books that were taken and written for church services, and they would quote portions of Scripture, which are going to help you find that portion of Scripture. Of course, they might be edited a bit, where they're only going to read certain verses, so they might be deliberately shortened a little bit, and we don't want to make that assumption just because the lectionary has one version and Greek manuscripts of the New Testament have another version. We don't want to just assume that the passage was inadvertently changed. Not necessarily. Now we also have, with the New Testament, we have it in translations as well. We have fairly early in the church, the New Testament was translated into Latin. In fact, both Old and New Testament were translated into Latin. Another translation is the Aramaic. Aramaic is quite a bit similar to Hebrew, but they are separate languages. The Romans referred to this not as Aram. They had changed the name to Syria. And so when we talk about the Syriac versus the Aramaic, they're the same, just two different ways of describing the same thing. And the Aramaic Peshitta is a early translation of the Old and New Testament into Aramaic. We also have the Coptic. The word Coptic just means Egyptian. And if you want to hear ancient Egyptian today, actually you can go down to Egypt, go into the Coptic church, the Christian church in Egypt, and in the same way the Roman Catholics oftentimes will read the Bible in Latin, the Egyptian church to this day still reads the Bible, at least for their liturgical services, reads it in Coptic, that is in ancient Egyptian. The Bible early on was translated into Ethiopian. That's another early translation. Persian was another of those translations. And we also have quotations of the early church fathers where sometimes one of the early church fathers in a letter or in a book or a writing, he would quote from the scriptures, and this will give us testimony to what version of the Bible that he had with regard to these textual questions. We'll see some of those. That actually comes into effect when we look at Mark chapter 16, where we have Irenaeus, early church father. He's going to quote from the latter part of Mark 16, a part that's missing in some of our oldest Greek manuscripts, and yet he read them in his manuscripts much earlier, at an earlier date than our oldest Greek manuscripts of that passage. Now, writing materials that were used, we've already talked about papyri and vellum, and remember that papyri grows in Egypt. It's very good for a dry climate. Vellum, that's animal skin, and vellum especially comes into view later on. If you're looking at papyri, chances are it's a very early, in some of our very earliest copies of the New Testament or papyri. Vellum are usually just a bit later, although some of those can be quite early too, but they're usually a bit later. Now, the earlier the manuscript, the less punctuation you're going to have. They use little or no punctuation in the earliest texts. Later on, these things would be added, and especially once you get the printing press, now we can hardly read without them. But the original text would have had very little or no punctuation, no periods, commas, quotation marks, things like that. They simply weren't used. That's from the context. Likewise, paragraph or chapter divisions are going to be much later. They would begin to have paragraph divisions, but the chapter divisions that we're used to, these are added at a much, much later date. Likewise, verse divisions, this is something that's going to happen much later. The early texts, the early manuscripts have none of these. Indeed, there were little or no spaces between the words, because this was a cost-saving thing. Remember, each sheet of vellum was very expensive, and so in order to compress that type, they would not put a great deal, and sometimes no spaces at all, between the words. Now, they were used to that, so to us that would be odd and difficult to read, but if you're used to it, it's not that big of an issue. The New Testament writers would also use what is called nomina sacra, that is, sacred abbreviations, so that instead of writing out the word theos for God, they might just put the theta and the sigma. Of course, this is in uncials as capital letters, and then to signify they were doing that, very oftentimes they'd put a parallel line, a horizontal line over the shortened word. Another A nomina sacra for the word Kyrie, Lord, especially when it's in the vocative, when one is speaking to the Lord, is the kappa and the epsilon. We would say Ke. The name of Jesus, Jesus, would be, and it sounds like Spanish, I know, the iota and the eta, or perhaps the iota and the sigma. Again, all caps, and then with the horizontal line over those. The word for father, the Greek word pater, the pi and the rho could serve as an abbreviation for that. The word for spirit, pneuma, you could have the pi, then the nun, and the alpha could be used for that. Now, a line, as I said before, was normally placed over the abbreviated word. And so when you see the line, you know it's an abbreviation, at least in the copies that we have. Now, this becomes effective when we look, for example, at 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16. And we have in many of the Greek manuscripts, we read that God was manifested in the flesh. And yet some of the older texts, instead of saying God was manifested in the flesh, he was manifested in the flesh. Instead of theos, it's has. And you say, well, there's quite a bit of difference between theos and has. Not if there's an abbreviation. If this is abbreviated, then the word for God, theos, would be just the theta and the sigma, the th and s. And the word for has, notice as you see it pictured here, the difference between a theta and an omicron is just that one line in the middle. And it looks sort of stylized in my print here, but remember, when you're writing it, it's just a single line. And so this could have been not some deliberate attempt to do away with the deity of Jesus, but just a simple scribal error, an honest mistake. Well, who made the mistake? And my answer is, I'm not entirely sure. I wasn't there, but you can see how this was an honest mistake that a scribe made one way or the other, and it was passed on to other manuscripts. Now let's look at some of the papyri. This is papyri 66. We shorten that to just P66. This happens to be John chapter 1, verses 1 through 13. You can actually see the beginning in arche and logos, and in the beginning was the word. And in this case, you don't see, notice you don't see a lot of spaces between the separate words. Sometimes there's just a shadow of one, sometimes there's no space at all. In Papyri 66, we have most of the Gospel of John. The scribe here was very careful in his copying. We know that. Now, all scribes make little tiny mistakes here or there. If you've ever tried to copy something, certainly you've made at least one or two typos. But he was very careful and seems to have written one letter at a time, which may mean that he wasn't a professional scribe. Maybe he was a bookkeeper or some other sort of thing. Probably not a professional scribe, but he's being that much more careful. I'm not saying he doesn't make mistakes, but his mistakes are usually one or two letters, right next to each other, not a whole word or something like that. And so errors, yes, they would be there, but you look at the kind of error, and the kind of error actually makes it quite easy, quite a bit more easy to determine that it's an error and not an original reading. Now, by contrast, Papyri 75, this is again the same passage, John chapter 1. In this case, this series of papyri, they contain most of the Gospel of Luke and also of the Gospel of John. In this case, the scribe had excellent handwriting. He may have been a professional scribe, and he tends to smooth out the text in some of the rough places. He says, well, he's trying to help us understand maybe this language didn't say it quite right, or at least in his thinking, and he's trying to help us. He's not changing major passages, but maybe fixing what he perceives as spelling or grammatical issues, and he's smoothing out the text. In his writing, he's very similar to the Codex Vaticanus. You say, what on earth is that? We'll be talking about that in a future lecture. Now here's another example Romans chapter 8, verse 1, New American Standard Version reads, "Therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." And then the passage goes on to verse 2. When I read this in the King James Version, it begins the same way. "There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus." That's the same, but then adds the section, "who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit." How did you add something? Well, if you read both passages, whether it's New American Standard or King James, down to verse 4, you see that second part added again. In King James, it's added again. In New American Standard, you see it for the first time there, "who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit." Did Paul say it twice? Did he repeat himself? Or did we have a scribe who, as he was copying the text, inadvertently copied the same line twice, once in verse 1, and then wrote it again where it belongs in verse 4? Did New American Standard leave out something, or did the one who gave us King James, and it was the King James translators, not blaming them, I'm talking about the text from which their translation was taken, what we normally call the Textus Receptus, did it inadvertently add this line? So we can have several different types. First of all, we can have unintentional errors, and there's a number of categories under that. For example, from faulty eyesight, or maybe just a smudged manuscript where someone is copying from one manuscript to another, an older usually and now he's copying it new. We gave the example of 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16, where it says God was manifested in the flesh, or did it say he was manifested in the flesh? And how you write that might just be a single line, which might have been smudged, somebody didn't see it, and you say, well, which way? I'm not sure. It means the same thing. You say, well, God and he. In context, it's still God was manifested in the flesh. The context means the same. The context tells us it's the same thing. It's referring to Jesus, the one who was manifested in the flesh. But one is overtly very clear that it's telling us that Jesus is God. The other is still insinuating it, just not being quite so clear. But this was an honest mistake, not a deliberate change. Another of these could be either from faulty hearing or from the mind. Now, when I say faulty hearing, sometimes you get the idea that one person was reading the text and another person was copying down what he was hearing. That's probably not often the case. Instead, when you read the text, you would speak it out loud. And so as you said it, you might actually say it and then write it down a little bit different. So that's both from faulty hearing and also from the mind. Mark chapter 14 and verse 65, in speaking how the soldiers take Jesus, you have some manuscripts that say, and they struck him. Elaban is the Greek word there. Or they received him. There's a similar sounding word, ebalon. Notice how you just juxtapose the L and the B, and then double the L. They received him, which was, I have a feeling in the context, they were striking him, not receiving him. Of course, it could be, that could be somebody trying to fix the text, but I don't think so. I think that's probably speaking about how they were striking Jesus. Again, an honest mistake. It would be like, and this is Dan Wallace's illustration, he talks about how if we came across the Constitution that starts off, "We the people of the United States, in order to secure a more perfect onion." Huh? Not an onion. Obviously, that's a union that they were seeking to secure. Unless you're a farmer, you look at this change, this transcriptional error, and it's very easy to determine which it is. And most of the unintentional errors, likewise, are very easy to determine. You might have an omission of certain letters and words. It's usually, I don't know, is it easier to add something or to leave something out? I think it's probably easier to leave something out, to unintentionally omit something. An example of that is Luke chapter 8, verse 20, where you have an actual word, and it was told to him, speaking of Jesus, it was told to him, and then you have the quote, what was told to him. Or you have some manuscripts that say, and it was told to him saying, and then you have the quote. You see, that didn't change the meaning of the passage at all. A word was actually omitted. but it doesn't change at all the meaning of the passage. And most of the changes are like that. It still says essentially the same thing. You might have misreading of personal notes where some, perhaps a scribe or a later corrector puts in a little note, and then the next copyist comes along, maybe a year later or maybe 50 years later, and inadvertently copies that little note thinking it's part of the text. That didn't happen a lot, but it could happen. Now, those are all unintentional errors, but there could be some intentional changes. Now, I don't think these are for malicious purposes. They're not bad purposes. But for example, we have cases where there are spelling or grammatical updates. You say, does that mean the earlier text had a spelling mistake? Well, remember, they didn't have hard, fast rules for how you spell something. They didn't have dictionaries back then. And so there was the habitual way of spelling, and perhaps there would be sort of a non-habitual way of spelling. But as these things became more formalized, somebody might be updating the spelling and or the grammar to make it more readily understandable. Another of these could be the modernization of names and places. I think this could happen both Old and New Testament, where the name gradually either got changed to a new name or a modification of the way they would write that. Even today, if you go to Israel and you speak about Jerusalem, they'll refer to Yerushalayim. That's actually a different pronunciation from what you have in biblical times. It's the same city. It hasn't changed, but there's a modernization of those names and places. Sometimes you will have attempted harmonization where someone's trying to fix the text. Now, that doesn't happen very often in the Hebrew text. In fact, the Hebrew scribes very often would leave something they knew. Okay, there's a change that's been made, probably a mistake. Somebody made a typo, and we're sure that there's a typo, but we're not going to change it because it's not in our copy. And so they would faithfully preserve the text, and that's a wonderful thing because they were showing how faithful they were to the text. Now, I want to talk a bit about manuscript families. Families of manuscripts have been divided into several categories. I have three major families of the Greek text. There is the Alexandrian. Actually, we subdivide that sometimes into Proto-Alexandrian, that is very early Alexandrian, and then the Alexandrian. But I'm just going to lump them together right now. The Western text and also the Byzantine text. This is seen, for example, in Luke chapter 24, Luke 24:53, where the Alexandrian family says, and they were continually in the temple praising God. And then in the Western text, we read, and they were continually in the temple blessing God. Now, that's not a huge difference, two different words, but it means essentially the same thing. The Byzantine, which is a slightly later tradition, they didn't want to leave anything out, and so there we read, and they were continually in the temple praising and blessing God. They actually put them both in. It hasn't changed substantially the meaning of the passage, but those are real textual differences. And these differences, these textual families, actually relate to geographical areas, although that doesn't mean every manuscript is found necessarily in those. But we use this, generally speaking, the Alexandrian family, we call it that because many of them originated from the area of Alexandria in Egypt. The Byzantine family, localized around Constantinople, or what we call today Istanbul. The Western family, because they tend to be Latin, so Latin in the West, in Rome and Gaul and places to the West. So generally speaking, these are geographic designations, although there are lots of exceptions. They color outside those geographic lines. Now, the variants in the New Testament manuscripts, first of all, the vast majority are spelling errors and or changes or adaptations, but in the area of how you spell something. Secondly, there's variations that actually don't affect our translation. In other words, you might have two different Greek words, but they mean the same thing. And so if you're translating it, you're going to translate it the same way either way, and it doesn't affect your English translation as you're reading it. The third type are those that are meaningful, but not viable. Like we use the example, in order to form a more perfect onion. Nobody thinks that would be correct. And there are those errors, and they were errors, that were obvious errors, and nobody had to question, gee, was that part of the text or not? It's the fourth category that we have to actually study sometimes. And these are meaningful and viable variants. And we've looked at a few of these. We'll look at a few more in our upcoming studies of both Old and New Testament. My old Hebrew exegesis professor, Dr. Laird Harris, said in one of his books, it thus develops that we do not have an embarrassing welter of 3,000 manuscripts disagreeing in confusing ways, but that these manuscripts have been copied with considerable care from a few old and standard editions. And so the Bible has been preserved. It has been preserved very exactly, and yet occasionally there's a question about a word here or about a word there.